going to start with a story. Sunil was a 15-year-old girl living in the largest red light district in a very large city where she lived. Probably one of the largest red light districts anywhere in the world. She was living there and she was working there. Sunil had been sold to a brothel by her family when she was 13 years old. They had debts that they couldn't pay, overwhelming debts, and to cover those debts, or at least some of them, they sold Sunil, it's a 13-year-old, to the owner of this brothel. Sunil worked in that brothel, and she served the men who came to that brothel as customers every night. And she longed for release. She longed for a different way of life. And one night, she remembered an evangelist, Christian evangelist, who had visited her village when she was a little girl. And he had talked about Jesus and his power, his ability to set free those who are in bondage. And she prayed to this Jesus, and she said, that night she said, "If you can release me from this bondage, I'll give my life to you." And that very night, an intervention team made up of local police and social workers from a Christian ministry to the street women of the red light district, they raided that brothel, and they arrested the brothel owner, and they took the women out of that brothel, and they took them to a shelter, which was run by this Christian ministry. And they gave those women an opportunity to learn different vocations, trades, basically to completely leave that life behind. The brothel owner went to prison, so he wasn't going to be following them up. And Sunil was also taught about this Jesus who she recognized had freed her from this bondage in the first place. And she gave her life to Jesus. She also learned to sew. She became a seamstress, and she learned how to make curtains. She stayed with the ministry of that Christian work for a while, but eventually she transitioned into a local church. She became a member of that church. She was actually baptized at that church and became a member. And that was a very difficult challenge in its own right, because by many of the people in that church, she wasn't accepted. She had to meet with a lot of rejection because of her background, because of what she had come out of. And even the fact, or maybe especially the fact, that some of the men in that church, who were members of that church, had also been her customers in the brothel where she served. But she hung in there. She persevered. She didn't give up. And she followed the Lord in that church. And eventually, that church embraced her. It really embraced her as a full and an important and a valued member of their fellowship. And not only that, but through their relationship with her, they recognized their own ministry, their own calling to the other street women, the other prostitutes of their city. And now, this day, they have a very active and a very powerful ministry to the prostitutes of that city. Well, keep that story in the back of your mind. Remember Sunil? We're going to come back to her. But let's have a look at this passage in this story here in the book of Acts. Now, you know the story. Peter has had this vision, very remarkable vision, and he's been called to visit Cornelius and basically to preach the gospel, to take the gospel to Cornelius and his family. He's a bit reluctant to do that. He's a good Jew after all, and good Jews don't associate with Gentiles, let alone actually visit and fellowship with them in their house. But he does it, and something remarkable happens, and then word gets back to the church, to the Jerusalem church, that this has taken place. And they're upset. And you can read into this that they've basically called Peter on the carpet, the leadership of the church, for what he's done. And remember, these are good Jews, very good Jews, true to their Jewish faith and tradition, who see in Jesus Christ as the Messiah, the fulfillment of everything it means to be a Jew. And then one of their own leaders, in fact, has gone off and done essentially unclean things with this Gentile. Now, what's this all about? What's going on? So they call Peter on the carpet, and they're accusing him, they're criticizing him. And Peter responds. He tells the story as simply as he and boldly as he can. And you can understand Peter's feeling a bit defensive here. And I think there's just little indications, like Peter's reference to these 6 brothers were with me. You can imagine him standing there, facing these sort of sharp-eyed church elders and feeling a bit awkward and a bit defensive, say, well, look, I had witnesses. I didn't just do this on my own. They were there too. And they saw what took place. And Peter's testimony is, of course, that as reluctant as he was, God affirmed that action in a powerful way by causing his Holy Spirit to fall upon Cornelius and his household in the same exact way that he had for the Jews beforehand. And the church comes around. It's really challenging for them. It really attacks everything that they cherish and that they hold true, and centuries of tradition and generations of faithfulness to their Jewish faith. It hits the roots of all of those things, but they listen, they recognize the hand of God in this, and they accept it. And this is my first point. Mission, not only through mission, God not only converts the world, he converts the church. And I have a quote to read from you from a missionary, a man named Leslie Newbegin, who was a missionary pretty much all of his life in India. And on this passage, as he's reflecting, writing a commentary on this passage, he says this, he makes this comment. Quite plainly in this case, there is a conversion of the church as well as the conversion of Cornelius. It's not only through the church, it's not as though the church opened its gates to admit a new person into its company and then closed them again, remaining unchanged except for the addition of a new name to its roll of members. Mission is not just church extension. It's something more costly and more revolutionary. It's the action of the Holy Spirit who in his sovereign freedom convicts the world and leads the church toward the fullness of the truth that it has not yet grasped. And the question for us is, as a church, what is the fullness of truth about God that we have not yet grasped? For Sunil's church, it was very difficult. It was a real challenging thing to all of their cultural assumptions. This woman, who they thought of as unclean and cursed, to be challenged by God and to be converted into seeing her not as cursed, not as unclean, but as a valued and as a precious object of God's love, as indeed the other women of the red light district were just the same. That took a work of God's Spirit to convert the church at a very deep level. Challenging. Each person who comes to the Lord, each person who comes to faith and joins us in fellowship here, each person brings an experience of God that we need. Some piece of the puzzle of who God is that apart from that piece, there's a blank space in that bigger picture. And we need those pieces. And our missionaries, as much as we like to think of our missionaries as a projection of our commitment to global evangelism onto the world, and they are, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's exactly what they are. They are a sign, they are a part, an indication of our commitment, and they should be. But as much as they're a projection of that commitment on the world, they're also a bridge. They're bridges. They're two-way bridges. Not just taking what we have to offer to the world, but they're connected with, they're working in communities, with communities where God is doing remarkable things, extraordinary things, miraculous things, revealing things. And those experiences, if we're paying attention, they come back to us as well. Oscar Muriu is the senior pastor of the Nairobi Chapel, in Nairobi Chapel in Kenya. It's not just one church. It's actually now, it's an association of churches throughout Kenya. Very large church, very active evangelical movement. And the mother church of that is a huge church in Nairobi City. Oscar is the senior pastor for that church. And he's a big guy. He's very imposing, and he's got a very deep and very resonant voice. And he's a powerful speaker, and he's an inspiring speaker. And he's often asked, as a result, to speak at conferences, well, pretty much all over the world, but often in the United States and in North America. And he's a little bit of a stirrer, too, Oscar. He likes to sort of mess with your mind a bit. Well, Oscar, at these conferences, he's always intent on getting the pastors in these conferences together afterwards. And often he'll organize special events for them so he can get the pastors together in one place. And at a certain point, as he's speaking to them, he'll lean over the podium and he'll look at them, this big, huge guy, and he'll say to the pastors, "Now, what does your church need from the African church?" And there's stone silence, almost always, dead silence afterwards. And he stands back and he says, "And I can see the wheels turning in the minds of those pastors, and they're thinking, I've never even thought of that." But it's a good question, isn't it? Biblically, if we understand part of the bigger body that we're a part of, it's a really good question. It's an important question. And it's something that even just as a local church, as an individual church, with our commitment to missions, it's something that we can miss and we need to pay attention to if we want to get the full benefit of. What do we need from what God is doing in the places where we have sent our missionaries? What do we need from the people who, through the ministry of this church, come to know the Lord and join us in fellowship? Through mission, God not only converts the world, he converts the church. There's another part to that. Let me move on a little further with Leslie Newbegin here and his second part of his statement on this passage. Mission is not essentially an action by which the church puts forth its own power and wisdom to conquer the world around it. And at that point, having been in missions pretty much most of my adult life, I confess I'm really often sort of moved by those very military sort of metaphors about missions that we tend to use, attacking the enemy and going to the front line and serving on the front line. And it's not an inappropriate metaphor in many ways. That's all true. But it's a little bit misleading if our orientation is, and as it tends to become, that somehow we have some power to bring against this enemy that's going to conquer him, or even that's going to contribute to conquering him. Anyway, let me read on a little further. Mission is not essentially an action by which the church puts forth its own power and wisdom to conquer the world around it. It is rather an action of God, putting forth the power of his Spirit to bring the universal work of Christ for the salvation of the world nearer to its completion. At the end of this story in Acts, which runs from Acts 10:1 through 11:18, the church itself became a kind of society different from what it was before Peter and Cornelius met. If we want to see the power of God, we need the heart of God. If we want to see the power of God unleashed on the world, and not just the profoundly limited resources of City Reach Baptist Church, we need the heart of God. If we want to see the power of God unleashed on the world, the power of God that rescued Sunil and saved her, and made her a vessel of healing and reconciliation to a broken community, we need the heart of God. And what does the heart of God look like? Well, I have had a very personal encounter with that just recently in my own family. We were having a chat, a family discussion one night, and my youngest daughter, Alexandra, she asked this question. She said, "In heaven, how can we be happy if people we know aren't there with us?" Don't you love it when your kids ask you questions like that? I was flummoxed, I'll be honest. I didn't really know how to answer that question. I know this. It raises a paradox, and you're probably familiar with this paradox when I put it this way. I know this much. I'm very, very confident in this. In heavenly eternity, there will be no sorrow, and there will be no grief, and every tear will be wiped away. And we have God's promise in written form that that's true. I know that, I believe that, and I believe that in the in the unveiled presence of God's glory. Before that, I doubt if I'll have any real questions left. I don't think there will be too many questions or any doubts. And if we could say anything at all, it certainly won't be in the form of questions. I believe that. So there will be, in the presence of God, there will be a sense in which we understand the rightness of everything that God has done. And it'll make sense. I believe that. But for this time, for this world, for this life, while God suspends his judgment and waits patiently for the harvesters to bring in the harvest, that is the right question. Alexander's question is the right question. That is the heart of God. It's the question that we all need to have. It's the question that needs to guide us all. Confessions here. Now you don't have to confess publicly, but I reckon this is not only true of me. My own experience of the day-to-day power of God is mediocre. Mediocre, probably at best, mediocre. And I don't think I'm the only one here who would say that, who would have to say that. We have our agenda for our life that we're pursuing. And we ask God to intervene in our life, to step into our life, to help us to pursue that agenda. So much of our prayer life and the requests that we make and the things that we share with God are really our invitation to God to participate with us in furthering our agenda. And he will, he does. There's really nothing wrong with that in itself. Obviously, he invites us to do that. But along with that, he turns that invitation around all the time and invites us to participate with him in his agenda, in his heart, in what's important to him. And I think Alexander's question is a perfect reflection of God's heart. And let me give you another and a biblical example. Jesus Christ, Jesus himself, standing before the city of Jerusalem in chapter 23 of Matthew's gospel. And he's looking upon the city of Jerusalem longingly with a broken heart. And he says, "O Jerusalem, how often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you would not." Hear the longing of Jesus for his people in that question. The heart of God. The heart of Jesus before Jerusalem. The heart of a teenage girl who can't conceive of being content without her friends with her in eternity. That's the heart of God. That's the heart that will allow us to see, that gives us the focus to see the power of God, the Spirit of God unleashed on the world. Do you realize that even from a secular statistical standpoint, it is well established, if not well known, that at this moment in history, there are more people coming to faith in Jesus Christ, far more people coming to faith in Jesus Christ than ever before in history. It's getting to be a kind of exponential thing almost. And that's just one indication of the power of God unleashed on the world. Is that where our heart is? Is that where our orientation is? And I'm not even talking about radically reorienting your life. I think we can all go ahead plowing ahead pretty much with the plans just as they are. But if our heart shifts focus, and suddenly that very ordinary life takes on a completely different focus of orientation, what does God think about these people in my life? What is his concern for them? What does he want them to know? What is my experience that I can just naturally and should just naturally share with them that will say something to them? That's when we will see the power of God unleashed on the world, unleashed on our world. And those were my basically 2 points for this sermon. Through mission, God converts not only the world but the church. And if you want to see the power of God, we need to have the heart of God. But as I was working through this, I had sort of an additional thought, as an afterthought. And I think it fits here, so I'm going to share it with you. We have a gift, don't we? We've been singing about that. An incredible gift, a precious gift in the gospel, in salvation. An amazing gift. And it's a little bit like a beautiful ring that someone's given you. Valuable, precious, and beautiful. You don't take that ring, put it back in its box, and set it on a shelf. And just appreciate the fact that you've got it. If you did, first of all, the person who gave you that ring in the first place, never seeing it on your hand, would probably think, well, I wonder, do they really even value that gift? On the one hand. And in addition to that, the real value of that gift is only sort of fully realized in wearing it and appreciating it, and in a sense, in showing it off. That's the gift that we have. We are the redeemed. Redemption is grace. Grace is a gift. We'll only discover the full value of that gift in sharing it. Isn't that right? Pray with me in closing, all right?